a virus that seems to have come from nowhere dropped a global system to its knees. In the case of the Caribbean community, the first known confirmed case was in Jamaica in March 2020.
The first incident we had was March 10, 2020, when a returning resident was diagnosed with the virus.
Lockdown to rebound, the impact on the social and economic environment of the Caribbean. The Caribbean, known for its award-winning tourism and vibrant culture that relied mostly on visitors from Europe and North America, was swept into a wave of uncertainty.
We observed our real first spike in cases in Barbados. And the government took an initiative to determine that it was important to follow up testing, to test for COVID-19, and also would then isolate, quarantine, etc.
We compared the response of the Caribbean with other indicator countries, not just countries that struggled, but countries that did well. And what we were able to show is that the Caribbean moved very swiftly. So the majority of Caribbean countries, they actually shut down before there was a single death. And some actually closed their borders before there was a single case.
We felt that once there is a viral disease, science was saying to us, could be conveyed through the air, it's a human-to-human contact, it's breathing into people or otherwise in the atmosphere within a distance, and it falls on any individual, or indeed it has capacity to stay on surfaces for an extended period.
When COVID-19 hit us, hit the region, the world in 2020, we were already very well prepared to pivot into what others were really moving feverishly to adopt. So we were there ready. So that there was no or very minor interruption in our proceedings.
The sports and entertainment sector experienced losses from medium and large events, and the lost revenue is estimated in excess of $26.182 billion.
When the ban on large gatherings was announced, the entertainment industry was immediately shut down. Here at Reggae Sumfest, the team was actually planning on the 2020 festival when we had to come to an abrupt stop. Workers were devastated as companies and individuals rely on revenue earned from events.
People in the entertainment industry, obviously, initially, we would be shocked. We would go in despair. We would go in fear, because you're talking about livelihoods just being taken away immediately.
Once the pandemic took place, sport ceased all over the world. The first sporting activity to resume was the West Indies Cricket Tour of England. And that was a very strict biosecure bubble, meaning that we had to move people from the Caribbean to England and keep them separated from everybody.
England showed the rest of the world that cricket could still be played during the coronavirus pandemic. The CPL was one of the first major cricket leagues to start during the lockdown.
I call the English bubble what I call a contained bubble. Everything was within one premises: the hotel, the practice facilities, the ground. This one in Trinidad we call the water and glove bubble, and we've published this, where if you take a glove and fill it with water, the water goes into the fingers, but it doesn't actually escape. The CPL was the first professional league to resume. And what we had in that scenario was something like 105 people that we had, 120 odd people that we had to transport. We showed a way that sports could be played. But what we were able to do was to come in a hotel at a beach. And so the entire cohort stayed at the beach in Antigua, in St. Lucia, in St. Kitts for that matter, etc., etc. And so what happened was that though you're confined to effectively what was all-inclusive, you could go to the beach, you could go to the gym, you could walk around the property. That was something we could offer that, for example, in Dubai they couldn't. The CPL, for example, would have lost once again millions of dollars in TV revenue. That was regained because we were able to play this in one territory.
The financial fragility of many small businesses caused a major economic shock, and the significant impact of COVID-19 related disruptions began just a few weeks into the crisis with mass layoffs and closures.
Compared to the socioeconomic impact, where the wealthier countries were able to buttress the impact on people's lives with furlough schemes and income support schemes, we don't have that kind of fiscal capacity here.
There's a general view that the pandemic aggravated, reinforced certain challenges we have been having in the Caribbean in relation, for instance, to the issue of poverty as a result of loss of jobs, as a result of loss of income.
I'm thinking about the number of businesses that have closed down. You pass through the mall and it's almost every week you see another one with a close sign. And it tells you that this thing is real and it's ongoing. And there are some people who are surviving by the thread. And it's only when you see a close sign you recognize that they can't anymore. They can't hold on.
The government provided assistance in the form of cash transfers to support the most vulnerable population. Nearly 500,000 Jamaicans received assistance, including persons who lost employment during the pandemic.
We at Sumfest realized more than ever that we were our brother's keepers and saw it as our responsibility to step up our outreach during this period.
We established food packages, what we call care packages for communities across Jamaica, particularly those that were socially deprived, those in fact who are on our PATH program. The PATH program is our response to poverty alleviation.
Coronavirus job losses have impacted everyone. But women are the ones who are most likely the victim of this economic crisis.
We still have those realities where certain women are disadvantaged in terms of access to work, in terms of access to education, in terms of access to or being paid, on equal terms as men. You still have those labor force issues.
In this time, because of the pandemic, things are slow because most people get cut off from their jobs. So in the streets, you have more seller than buyer.
The COVID pandemic disrupted family routines and relationships. And as the stay-at-home orders increased, more families were at risk.
During crisis, violence against women increases. And so we've had a lot of reports from various agencies, from women's organizations that are often on the front line of response about the increase in violence against women because of lockdown.
Based on police statistics and police data, suggests that you also had an uptake in child abuse, in particular across the region.
We all thought that the pandemic would be short-lived. Reggae Sumfest was actually the first major virtual festival to be staged. We were able to present an excellent show dubbed The Taste of Reggae Sumfest.
The isolation of it all, yes. 2020 was hard in particular because it was my 40th year. So that emotionally, I remember when the Love and Harmony cruise was supposed to happen that April.
School closures have severely disrupted education, and remote learning was out of reach for many. Lack of connectivity and services excluded students from learning.
In the move or shift to online learning, there are regions of the world and there are areas within countries that still do not have access to the internet because of economic income issues. So children who did not have access to a tablet or a laptop would have been disadvantaged in the move from face-to-face delivery to online delivery.
As a result of the coronavirus crisis, almost all tertiary education institutions and schools in the Caribbean have had to close. The University of the West Indies in Jamaica could not close due to the many operations and activities on campus, such as housing over 1,000 regional and international students.
We couldn't close. We have our post office, we have our police station, we're a part of the hospital base, and we had students from all over. Once we recognized that this was a pandemic, we prepared ourselves by creating layers of committees which allowed us the best advice.
We created this task force using the reach that the university has. And so it provided a single focal point for all of the governments.
We adopted the masking protocol, which required all persons, once they're in a public space, to wear masks. That was the first one. We went to remote teaching and learning. We also did remote working, so staff members were allowed to work remotely.
We did do a series of training sessions for the lecturers in terms of learning how to teach in the online space. I think students have mixed feelings about it still. I think some lecturers just never expected to have to do this in the first place. It's the first online graduation that was happening, and students really missed that face-to-face experience of, you've worked so hard for 3 years. You want to walk across the stage physically and collect that degree and feel that happiness with your family, right?
We took the model which we had established in disaster recovery. So, for example, when Tropical Storm Erica caused all that damage in Dominica, the university would send out a task force. So it would have, for example, psychologists and counselors to help people deal with trauma.
So the emergency management committee that was set up would have had two primary roles. One was to ensure the safety of students and staff throughout the pandemic. Secondly, was to ensure that we could have continuous operation of the campus.
As the Guild president, I sit on the COVID-19 management task force along with the principal and other members of senior administration. We also sit on every major committee of the university, and so we're always looking at how do we have to change and adapt given the COVID-19 pandemic. But there was a study done in which they saw that there was an increase in depression and anxiety levels amongst the student body. So as a Guild, what we would have done is I organized a partnership with UNICEF as they were releasing a mental health chatline in partnership with the Ministry of Health.
The health systems have been grossly overwhelmed by the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic is not the first, and certainly not the last, to savagely hit the world.
From a health point of view nationally, was to ensure that we were not going to have a sort of impact on the health system, right? Because we know because of how transmissible COVID-19 is, we could easily have an impact on the system.
The overwhelming majority of nurses, for example, and nurses are the ones who are delivering most of the care.
It has affected all of our lives in the hospital, especially within the last few months, with COVID cases rising at a dramatic increase. I would say a positive out of it has made us all more vigilant in terms of infection control measures. However, our socialization in hospital has certainly declined for protection of ourselves and others. And in terms of the workload, because of all the COVID positive cases, it's more or less the same staffing being dispersed to help in the parallel healthcare systems. And yet the public healthcare system still has to run as a functional capacity.
While the COVID-19 pandemic was affecting much of the world, it had a disproportionate impact on the members of the Caribbean community, CARICOM. CARICOM member states received the much anticipated Pfizer vaccines, with 1.5 million doses being allocated to Haiti and the other 4 million doses for distribution among 14 CARICOM countries.
We cannot create our own vaccines. And this makes us vulnerable. So we had to wait on Pfizer. We had to wait, depend on the United States or England, to send us some vaccines. So it reinforced a kind of dependency, COVID-19, that we are all too familiar with, particularly in relation to vaccines, pharmaceuticals, and dealing with that virus.
I was actually very pleased in the way in which we approached the pandemic and also securing vaccines. So we tried to secure vaccines as a region rather than each individual country.
The benefits of being vaccinated, in terms of how it reduces your likelihood of death and severe sickness. Community drive, going into communities, especially densely populated areas with the mobile vans, and having more vaccination sites, I think also help in the uptake of vaccine.
No vaccine! Unfortunately, vaccine hesitancy rates in the Caribbean remain unacceptably high in response to COVID-19. The approach to the vaccine is with a high level of skepticism, fueled by conspiracy theories and disinformation.
I would have to say that after the initial hesitancy, it's a vast minority of people who probably don't want to vaccinate. I think by and large, everybody is.
Understanding what is affecting the level of hesitancy, vaccine hesitancy. And part of our response was really around looking at the cultural practices and the belief systems of people across the region.
Even though our vaccination rates have not been high, and that's been a source of concern for many, the irony of it all is that all the other indicators are way below global average.
The West Indies Cricket Board made a rule that you have to be vaccinated, and that was because we could not go to other countries if they're not vaccinated. But the IPL, for example, the lucrative league in cricket, insisted that everybody must be vaccinated. So many of those who were hesitant initially were the first in line when the IPL said you have to vaccinate.
There was that hesitancy, which is reflected in the figures that it's just over 50% of this small population of 1.3, 1.4 million persons have been vaccinated.
There are countries in the global south that overall the rate of vaccination is very low because of global vaccine inequality.
Not being aware of the vaccine in terms of the harms, so having more information about the vaccine would have been important to individuals.
People were again having doubts, distrusting the vaccine and its effectiveness to deal with the virus.
Age increases the risk for the physical impacts of COVID-19. People 65 and older who received both doses of either Pfizer or Moderna vaccines showed a more reduced risk of COVID-19 related hospitalization.
Across the world, they were targeting what they call the frontline workers, the ambulance drivers, the nurses, the medical doctors. So they were targeting persons within the health sector first, and outside of the health sector, they were targeting persons who belong to a particular age demographic, 60 and over, because of some assumption that they were more vulnerable, to the virus.
COVID-19 has impacted predominantly the elderly and the children, the two most vulnerable persons in our society.
It was very difficult for the elderly. Many elderly people are either not computer literate or live in rural areas where there's no internet.
Certain entities are looking at how they're going to plan for pandemics now or later on. Have you included the voice of the elderly and also the voice of children? Because the policies you're putting in place impact them, but you're not hearing from them as to see how these things actually impacted them.
They started to put out advertisements, jingles that were on radio. They also had newspaper. Older people do read their newspapers.
Limited take-up of the COVID-19 vaccine has been an ongoing issue, hampering the response to the pandemic. the need to tailor vaccine promotions was highlighted.
Government of Jamaica, as early in fact as February, established an emergency task force at the office of the Prime Minister. And we had our first meeting then, examining not just the virus and its implications as it was spreading. Although it was not yet declared a pandemic, Jamaica understood that we had to start preparatory activities.
When we hear about building back or stimulating the economy, a lot of what we have heard about here in Barbados in particular has been the construction sector, right? Which is also a very gendered area of the economy.
It was critical to get persons back to work.
It's one thing to preserve the health of your country, but if everybody is indoors, all industry has closed down, the country is on its knees economically, you have to open up again.
Experience suggests that the Caribbean has an extraordinary resilience and ability to bounce back from a variety of crises. If the past 2 years has taught us anything, it is that countries globally will be better placed to deal with and recover from shocks.
The Caribbean is blessed to have a primary healthcare structure in place. Those community doctors, nurses, public health inspectors.
We have recovered faster than the Caribbean. We've recovered faster than the world. In fact, our recovery rate is twice that of the global recovery.
At each step of the game, our students and staff rose to the challenge. They found new ways of doing things. And as we kept on meeting with them and asking them to adapt, find a different way, they did it, and we were successful, and we are where we are now.
Recovery has got its own challenges, because with recovery, we have had to contend with the disruptions in the supply chain. Jamaica has a very high quotient of well-prepared hospitality workers. Some people think we have hospitality in our DNA.
While it is too early to fully grasp the impact of the virus, the challenge will be to return in the shortest possible time to normality, growth, and development.
This Anthropocene era that we're in has taught us many things. It has taught us that man is a frail and fallible being that has to deal constantly with changes and has to be adaptive, that we have to innovate. Man has the capacity to think, to act, and to respond.